Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm Glenda Rose, President of Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, joining state archaeologist Dr. Sarah Sportman, co-host Scott Brady, and today's special guests. Today's program gets us down in the dirt. Many of our FOSA members live for the dig. The excitement of unearthing an artifact not seen in perhaps thousands of years can be quite a rush. And identifying a potential site can be just as exciting as we anticipate what might lie below the surface. But remember, however exciting a find may be, FOSA does not condone anyone taking on their own individual dig on public or private property. We promote the policy of, if you see something, say something. So please report an artifact or site discovery by sending an email to fosa.ct@gmail.com with the word found in the subject, and we will notify Sarah for further research. So let me step off my soapbox now and turn things over to Sarah to give us some background information and introduce our guests.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the May episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. This month, we're going to be talking about our ongoing work at a relatively new site that was discovered in Avon, Connecticut back in 2024, last summer. And it came to us in a kind of roundabout way, and it's been a little bit of a challenge and a struggle, but it still is a very exciting discovery. So we'll be talking about the site this evening with our guests, Dr. Leslie and Stephanie Scialo, who are two archaeologists who have been working with us on the mitigation of this site. But let me just give you a little bit of background information before we get started so you know what we're on about. So back in the summer of 2024, the Office of State Archaeology was contacted by an individual who had discovered a deeply buried archaeological site in Avon, Connecticut near the Farmington River. Intrigued by the geology and archaeology of the area, they conducted their own investigation, digging several pits on town-owned land near the banks of the Farmington River. And so this individual's interest had been piqued by the relatively recent discovery of a site that we've talked about a lot on this project, the Brian D. Jones site. That's that Paleo-Indian site in Avon, Connecticut, that we were involved in the excavation of back in 2019, and the analysis of that is ongoing. And the resulting public education program brought a lot of that information to the public through the town of Avon. And that site, the Brian Jones site, which is the oldest identified archaeological site in Connecticut to date, with radiocarbon dates going back to at least 12,700 years, is a really significant discovery. And archaeological and geophysical investigations of that site, along with analysis of deep soil cores from across that site area, indicated that the Jones site sat on an ancient levee, a particular landform along the Farmington River, and the preservation of that landform extends quite a ways along the riverbank in this part of the state, suggesting the potential for other deeply buried archaeological sites. And that is what this individual was interested in investigating, if there was any more of those. And so, this site and the investigation and the public programs about that really sparked their interest, which is great. And it's what it's supposed to do, but it had the downside of encouraging this individual to go out and undertake an unauthorized investigation on town land. So what we ended up doing was contacting the town, working with them, contacting the tribes, contacting the State Historic Preservation Office, and working out a plan to kind of mitigate the site that this person had found. So why don't I just turn it over to our guests, Stephanie Scialo, who has been working on the mitigation excavations out there, and Dave Leslie, who did a lot of the pre-excavation work, geophysical work, GPR, soil cores, that sort of thing, to just tell us a little bit more about the site and get going on this topic. You want to start, Steph?
So basically Sarah found out about the site and pulled us in. We had to build a team to help mitigate the damage to the terrace and assess how much of the terrace had been impacted by this individual, who basically went out by themselves with a backpack shovel, but managed to create quite a deep hole for themselves. So we went out, assessed the terrace, looked at the assemblage that he had handed over. We had a specialist look at the assemblage to kind of give us an idea of what we had going on. And what we felt we had was an array of artifacts that indicated an archaic and possible Paleo-Indian site on the terrace.
And this is not far from the Jones site. And so our initial thought was that this site might be related to that occupation and extend potentially back to that same time period. So in order to get a better sense of what was going on and to more fully investigate the site and figure out how best to mitigate the damage done to it by the initial investigation, we pulled together a research team and a plan to start mitigating the damage. And the first part of that was to do some geophysical work and some soil probes, or soil cores, to learn more about the landform. And I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk about that.
Yeah, I think that it's important for us to all sort of take a step back and think about the way that sites are preserved the way that archaeological sites are preserved in New England in general. In most instances, what we have is upland sites or some sites buried along rivers, but almost all archaeological sites that have been discovered in this state and in most parts of the country are sites where artifacts were deposited by people doing their normal daily activities. And then over time, those artifacts sort of make their way down through the sediment. And you might have a little bit of sediment gain through deposition from rivers or wind blowing around, but there's really not a lot. You have some soil loss over time. And that's not really the case here along the Farmington River. This is a deeply buried archaeological site. And by that, we mean a site that has been buried by several feet of sedimentation coming from the Farmington River. Those, in our understanding, are relatively rare. And they're really interesting because that deep preservation really removes the artifacts and potentially cultural features out of the impact zone of the normal day-to-day activities of people, say over the last 300, 400 years, where there's a lot of colonial activity. Think of the times that the forests in Avon have been clear-cut for logging, 2 or 3 times probably, right? Plowing that happens. These are all sort of normal activities that disturb archaeological sites. And we knew that the Jones site, which is located to the north, was deeply buried because of work that had been done there for the Connecticut Department of Transportation, where that site was preserved about 5 to 6 feet below the ground. One of the most important discoveries associated with that site wasn't the 27 cultural features or the thousands of artifacts. Those were all incredibly important, but it was the preservation of that site deeply buried and protected by all the sort of normal soil processes and human activities that I was just talking about. And so one of the first things that we wanted to do here was to establish what's going on with the soils at the site. Is this also deeply buried? We had an idea based on information that had been provided to the Office of State Archaeology. I mean, the individual who had investigated the site said that he found artifacts deep. He found a feature deep. And so then we needed to verify that, but also to begin to understand what's happening at the site. And so one of the things that we've been doing over the last couple of years, and archaeologists have been doing this for a while, but the technology has become more readily available and easier to use. We do these things called remotely sensed or remote sensing techniques, where we're not really disturbing the soil, or we're minimally disturbing it to get a better idea of what's under the ground. And so we decided to do a combination of ground penetrating radar, where we use a ground penetrating radar machine at tight intervals, about 1 foot or 25 centimeters, back and forth across the landscape to image the layers of earth underneath the ground and to look at the landform. When we did that, what we found, it wasn't very surprising. It was very similar to the landform that was preserved downriver from where we were at the Jones site. What we found was a deeply buried levee. And so by that, we mean a stable landform adjacent to the river that was built over time through successive flooding, well-drained, sandy soils, You couldn't really ask for a better place to camp. You've got fresh water, access to the river. You've also got high order streams behind you, but it's really well drained. I mean, if you've been in Connecticut the last couple of weeks, you can appreciate how important that can be, right? And so the radar really helped pin down the preservation mechanisms. But of course, radar is only one way to look at it, and it's just a representation. And so what we wanted to do was test that with sediment cores. We use a technique called terrestrial vibracoring, where we use a concrete vibrating mixer to we attach it to these aluminum core barrels, and we drive the cores into the ground and then extract them. We did all of this with the Yukon Department of Earth Sciences, some graduate students and faculty, to establish what the actual sediments were, compare that with the ground penetrating radar. But also these cores give us a good window into sort of the microstratigraphy. So we're able to use geochemical and PXRF, so portable X-ray fluorescence technology, to look at the mineral components of the sediments at the site. That's another way for us to look at the sediment packages when they were deposited. We were able to radiocarbon date several of these layers as well. A lot of separate techniques to arrive at information that helps us understand the preservation mechanisms that have preserved this site. We know that people in the Paleo-Indian and other time periods spent a lot of times next to rivers, but a lot of that activity has been assumed to have been destroyed by really active, high-energy river systems. And that's not true here in the Farmington River Valley, and it's probably not true at other rivers too. And so that's one of the big conclusions that we're gaining from this work, is that it's helping us figure out how to identify these sites other places. But also these cores and the GPR data gives us a good window to compare with the small scale excavations that we have conducted to mitigate the damage that was done to the site. And there's really, I don't know of another site in New England that documents this amount of time depth in one location. Certainly the Jones site documents a lot of time depth, but it's from the early Archaic to the Paleo-Indian period. The excavations that we'll talk about today show that there are occupations from the late woodland through the early woodland, the late Archaic, middle Archaic, early Archaic, and Paleo-Indian period, all in one location, which is why it's critical for us to use as many techniques as possible, but to be as minimally invasive as possible so that this resource is protected and that we can understand it.
Yeah, and I would like to just jump in and say that one of the important aspects of this site and the preservation due to the soil deposition from the river is that we have that entire stratified sequence going from the woodland period all the way back to the Paleo-Indian period, but we have it in a nice, neat kind of stratified, separated way. So you're not getting mixing of deposits from different time periods. It's actually providing a pretty rare look at these time periods as individual slices without any noise from any earlier or later activities, which makes it a really incredible resource for research. So I would also like to just say that, you know, before we did this, we worked with the town, and they were incredibly helpful in facilitating this work and helping us figure out the best way to access the site to mitigate the damage and preserve this resource and learn as much as possible about it. They were super helpful. They came out and helped us clear brush and all kinds of things, facilitated access to the site. So it's really important, the partnership that we have working with the town in this project, to learn as much as possible about this resource and try to maintain the preservation of a good portion of it for the future as well. So let's talk about, once we had our GPR data and our soil cores done, what was the next step? Steph, can you talk a little bit about the plan for actually how much damage was done to the site and how we decided to go about mitigating it?
Yeah, so this is probably the step where it's so important for us to take the time to look through the assemblage that's handed over by the individual who has impacted the terrace. luckily, this individual had separated out the artifacts by his 4 separate impact areas. So we were able to look at each assemblage as a separate area and assign them to a disturbance area on the terrace. We ultimately decided that we should first and foremost look at this one area that we labeled Area E, because the individual had encountered what they thought to be a cultural feature with lots of charcoal, charred botanicals, macrobotanicals. So we went out to the terrace after Dave and his crew had finished coring and had finished their GPR survey. We were able to find Area E pretty quickly. It had been backfilled, but obviously sediment that has been pulled out of the ground and then backfilled in after rain, after however it's been impacted, always creates a kind of divot in the ground. And what we found was I would say like kind of devastating. When we do excavations, we do them by 1 meter by 1 meter square, and we often turn that into excavation blocks. We weren't quite sure what the extent of this excavation was, so myself and the volunteers decided to put a 2 by 2 meter excavation block comprised of 4 units over this disturbance and start excavating down. And as we excavated down in 10 centimeter levels, we also carefully documented and separated out the disturbed sediment from the natural undisturbed sediment. And the reason you do that is so that you can actually separate out what has been turbated up and what we call provenience, or the actual location in the ground for. And what we found in a 2 by 2 meter block, we found that cultural material went down to at least 190 centimeters below the ground surface, almost 200 centimeters below the ground surface. So 2 meters, about 6.5 feet. And unfortunately, we found that roughly 2% of that block had been completely disturbed, and that there were a significant amount of artifacts in the disturbed soil. And that's because the individual didn't use a screen. They also didn't have the experience that a lot of us, that do this on a daily basis do. We were finding full projectile points, hammerstones, but also many flakes, charcoal. But what we did find was, luckily, this impact had stopped before at least 4 cultural features that we encountered. So there was, I say 52% of the block is lost, but that means that 48% of the block was solid. But another way for us to kind of get a better idea of what's happening with the sediment, with the, the geology, the archaeology, is just to dig more. And of course, as archaeologists, it seems like we should always want to dig more, but there were a few reasons why we did this. We're talking about digging 2 meters below the ground surface. It's above my head. Expanding the block allows for more safety. It gives us a way out of the block. So we always had 2 ways out of the block, normally by, a step or a ladder. And that way we can kind of fulfill our OSHA protocols and keep ourselves safe, because if a wall collapses, that's just a whole issue. But also expanding, and to build on what Dave said earlier, is that we get to see the whole sediment profile from the modern era down to sterile soils below the paleo layer. And we didn't get that at the BDJ site. And that's because that terrace was investigated by kind of a 2-step process, where there was a previous survey that confirmed that there was no cultural material in the first, say, 4 feet. And then when the BDJ site was discovered, the first 4 feet of soil was already stripped off the ground surface for the ease of excavating that site. And here we don't have that, quote unquote issue. We have the entire profile. So we really did get to learn a lot about just the side of the Farmington River, both archaeologically and with the soil profile as well, and how this terrace has built up over time.
Yeah, and I would like to also kind of just talk a little bit about the process of actually doing this work, because so this was a project that came to us when this person realized that they had found something really significant and brought it forward. But there's basically no situation in place to fund a project like this, right? So all of this work had to be done basically on volunteer time and with volunteer effort from all of the different specialists involved and with the people who came out and helped to excavate. So, the really great and really amazing part about Connecticut Archaeology is that we do have, dedicated squads of volunteers who are willing to step in situations like this, sometimes on the weekends, sometimes, taking a vacation day from their regular jobs to come and dig. And part of it is that it's really cool to dig at a site like this that just has so much information potential. But another part of it, I think, is just that we have a really dedicated community who's willing to step in. But it does kind of also bring to the fore the issues of like the kind of damage that these types of explorations that people might undertake on their own can cause, and the ramifications of that. I mean, because it really, even just to mitigate one of the 4 areas has taken a tremendous amount of time and effort and kind of person power. So I just wanted to, kind of stress that as well.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say that it's the volunteer effort was instrumental, and it wouldn't have been possible without it, without volunteers. But the same is true of specialists. And also, I mean, some of these tests, whether or not we were volunteering, still had to be paid for. So we did a range of radiocarbon dates. Heritage consultants paid for those radiocarbon dates. One of the first things that we were interested in was the feature that was discovered by the individual. I don't think that we'll ever really know the depth of that feature, where he found it. And so that feature returned, we dated it twice. A late archaic date, and it was relatively deep, suggesting that it probably started pretty high up in the sediment column, but he just didn't notice it until he was really inside of the feature. Features can be, and by features we mean non-portable things from a site, but we're talking really here about a hearth, right? An open air fire pit. And so that was really sort of confusing to us, that this feature was around 150 centimeters based on the descriptions that he had given. And that's right where we sort of expected the Paleo-Indian or 10, 11, 12,000 year old stuff to be. And we got a date of about 5,500 years. However, I would say that did not deter any of the volunteers. And they persevered through many, many days of excavation. Deep test units are difficult to excavate for the reasons Steph outlined, but just the sheer volume of sediment that you have to move. And later radiocarbon dating of deeper features that were identified, as well as radiocarbon dating from the cores and the stratigraphic column, verified what we thought we already knew, that there were deposits from the middle to early Holocene. So by that we mean 5,000 to 10,000 years, and then older dates from the Pleistocene period. So 11 to 12, our deepest date came from 195 centimeters, right above the sort of coarse cobble layer, which we associate with the braided river system before it stabilizes and builds the levee. And that date came back 13,000 years ago, really constraining when we believe the earliest people were in the region. There are no dates of people here at 13,000 years ago. The oldest one is 12,700 years at the Brian Jones site. But there are megafauna. There's megafauna that's been discovered right, it's upriver, but south of where we are in Farmington. That's about 14,500 years old. And so it presents a really interesting series of data points or sediments where we're looking at that earliest time period when people are on the landscape, but then they return to this site over and over and over again. And that is really, really interesting. Suggesting, I mean, we know this, that rivers are, they're highways for people in the past, right? You can move up and down them. It's where animals are attracted as well. There's vegetation that's important, both, wetland plants as well as fish resources as well, anadromous fish. And so it's not surprising that people would be drawn to this landscape over and over again. It's just never been found before.
I think, we've talked a lot about the site kind of like more broadly, but it would be good to discuss the stratigraphy and the artifacts and the features in a little bit more detail. I would say that just, from my perspective, just thinking about what Dave was just talking about, people returning to this site time after time after time, I think it speaks really strongly to a lot of cultural continuity in this region. And yes, it's a place on the landscape that's really great for camping and for resources and things like that. But there's lots of places like that on the landscape. And I think that these places we find that people go back to time after time after time suggest that they, the knowledge of these places is probably being passed down through the countless generations, really kind of marking them as important and significant places in the landscape for Indigenous people. Maybe you guys could talk a little bit about what we found in the excavation unit, the stratigraphy, the types of artifacts and features that we recovered, because there are some really interesting materials that came out of this excavation.
Yeah. So basically what we encountered was at least 7 different sediment horizons is what we would call them. We have each one of these horizons often encapsulated a period of occupation of the terrace. There are some sparse historics near the ground surface, including some European flints, some pieces of iron from possible fences. Those could have possibly been brought in by floods. They could be representative of the nearby farm that's currently in place. But we're seeing a lot of different artifacts as we excavate down, and different uses of raw materials for stone tools as we descend farther into the ground. And ultimately, we encountered what we are confident to be an early woodland period. We recovered several Vignette 1 pottery sherds, so that's a decoration type that's on a clay pottery. It's an indigenous pottery. We have a late internal archaic package with small stem points, middle archaic with projectile points. And then we found this early archaic component with lots of high quality crystal quartz and what we term a Gulf of Maine archaic tradition technology, which is a lot of unifacial reduction, mass reduction of this high quality quartz. And then finally, artifacts that we feel are indicative that we know are indicative of a Paleo-Indian occupation with channel flakes and end thinning flakes that are basically made during the production of fluted points and large bifacial tools. Those materials are made out of very high quality chert and a red Norman scale chert. Those are found in the Hudson River Valley of New York. So we're seeing a transport of high quality materials from outside of the region into the region. And as we kind of move back towards the ground surface, if we're talking about these different horizons and occupation layers, we're starting to see more of the use of local materials, things that are found nearby. So that could just be representative of, how people are moving across the landscape, how they're gathering their resources. To date, we've managed to inventory 4.5 out of the 7 meters that we excavated, and that's totaled 6,852 artifacts. It's important to note that we haven't inventoried the 2 most disturbed units yet. However, 1,678 of those artifacts are from disturbed contexts. So we don't have the sediment horizon, the spatial data from where those artifacts are from. And that covers roughly 24.5% of the assemblage is disturbed. So while we can make assumptions about those artifacts, we cannot directly tie them unless they are diagnostic to a certain time period.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in real quick and say that in addition to the artifacts that Steph just mentioned, there are diagnostic artifacts that were found either by the individual who didn't record the stratigraphy, the ways that we've discussed, or in the back dirt, right? So in the disturbed soils. Some of those are diagnostic artifacts that we have not yet found in good context, but we know that those are, so we have parallel stem projectile points that are also from the early Archaic that looks like maybe a separate or related occupation during the early Archaic period. The middle Archaic projectile point that we have is from disturbed context. We know that there were people here during the middle Archaic, and we have a good idea of which depth it should be at, but we just don't have those in good context yet. That's one of the reasons why we're doing this work, is because as it existed before was sort of a jumbled mess of, we knew that these artifacts were here, but we didn't know the layers they came from, the sequence, right? And so understanding the sequence, understanding the spatial variation, understanding the reduction strategies. So by that, we mean the ways that people are making stone tools, what they're using those stone tools for. We can look at microscopic use wear on some of these. We haven't done it yet, but we plan to. Will help tell us a little bit more about the types of foods they were eating, maybe animals they were hunting, but also the time of year too. There are some botanicals that are within the features that have been excavated. There's some evidence recently of the charred wood analysis indicating what we would expect. Somewhat temperate wood species are available for people to bring back and use for their fires. Think about the ways that people might prefer mesquite versus other types of wood flavor for smoking their meats. Same thing in the past. People are using different types of wood fuel for their fires for different reasons. And as we look at the earlier or deeper features or just charcoal from that sediment, we start to see more of a pine pitch boreal forest, which is what you would expect. That's what the ecological reconstructions for this region suggest, is that it's more of a boreal pine forest during the Pleistocene, and that slowly gives way to the deciduous temperate forests that we know today too. So a lot of these different specialists are arriving at what we expect based on these time periods. And as an archaeologist, I find that comforting, but it's also a bit alarming if things fall the way that you think they should. So that's one of the reasons why we're continuing to investigate the other areas that were impacted, because we still need to sort of figure out some of these impacts. There are likely unknown occupations that we haven't found yet that are preserved on different parts of this landscape.
Steph, I'm glad that you mentioned the Vinette. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was the first site I've ever been on where any of it's ever been found. So I was pretty excited.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a ceramic specialist, but I think you know that you found something that people are really interested in when you send a picture to ceramic specialists and then get in the shower at the end of the day, and by the time you've gotten out of the shower, you have like 7 or 8 missed phone calls. Vinette 1 pottery is a decoration that is highly diagnostic of the early woodland period. A lot of, to my knowledge, a lot of Vinette 1 pottery sherds or even full pots were found by collectors, normally during the 70s and 80s. So the location and the recovery area of those artifacts is often unknown to us. We certainly were not expecting to find pottery at the site, given the assemblage that the individual gave to us. It did not have any pottery. It didn't have any diagnostic artifacts that indicated early woodland period. But, we had an undergrad with us who luckily was, very keen-eyed, and basically came over to me and said, "Is this pottery?" And my jaw kind of dropped. So that kind of changed the game for us. We were like, okay, hang on. We're not just talking about, a potential Paleo-Indian component, which we had kind of, honed in on with the assemblage. We're talking about much more, and a much wider, long-term, multi-generational use of this terrace.
And
Yeah,
correct
and
me correct me if I'm wrong, but the Vinette is probably one of the most early forms of pottery, right? This is what we think is the first pottery that's being used by the native peoples here in the Northeast.
Yeah, it's a very chunky pottery. It's very thick. Pottery thins out as we get closer to the contact period, as techniques change and adapt over time. So normally thick pieces of pottery is indicative of an early woodland time period, and you don't really see the use of clay pottery in this region prior to at least the terminal Archaic period.
Yeah, I think that the Vinette is, as Steph said, it's very thick. It tends to be relatively low fired, so it's also it crumbles pretty easily or breaks pretty easily. And one of the interesting things about this site is that we have very large sherds. We have sherds that crossmen, and we have the opportunity to see what else is found in association with that pottery at this site. And again, I think it just speaks to the incredible preservation, right? This very fragile material is deposited here by the people who left it behind. And because of the gentle kind of soil deposition from the river, it stayed largely intact for 3,000 years, just about, which is really important. So
I had a question too. You're probably aware further north on near the Farmington River in Barkhamsted, there was a site where they made bowls out of soapstone. I was just curious if you found any little bits of that, if there might have been trading going on or anything.
Yeah, we didn't find any steatite or soapstone, but that's you mentioned the Barkhamsted soapstone quarry, and one thing that we should mention is that prior to the work here, or the discovery of the Brian Jones site, there were years and years of the Farmington River Archaeological Project by Ken Fader, who also was involved in the Barkhamsted site, investigating the Farmington River, where he and his students at Central, and Fred Warner was involved in some of this as well, documented a deep history of use along the Farmington River. And so it just underpins how important this area has been to people in the past. And there is steatite. The soapstone it's only unlike clay pottery, where you can create that in a number of different environments. The sources of steatite is very rare. It basically falls along the Appalachian mountain chain, and that's it. On the eastern seaboard. And so there are some areas where people were quarrying them and then bringing them, but they're really heavy, big big bowls. And so that's why you don't find them lots of places. It's a terminal archaic technology, but it gives rise eventually to more portable, less heavy clay ceramics like the Vinette one that Steph was talking about.
Yeah. And I think, another point that we can kind of draw, around the pottery and some of the other things that Steph talked about, she talked about the amount of material that was out of context, that had been mixed up and redeposited with the Bacter, that the person who had investigated this site on their own did not collect. And I think that part of that is that, learning to be an archaeologist and learning the nuances of material culture and the proper way to collect materials, record data, and keep track of all that. So is something that takes a lot of time. And I think it's a good reason why somebody with a little bit of experience really isn't well equipped to go out and do something like this, because, things like indigenous pottery are quite difficult to recognize in the archaeological record, particularly if they're small sherds covered in dirt. They kind of just look like dirt clods, right? A lot of lithic materials that are such as like chipping debris and things like that are the byproducts of making tools are not super obvious. And if we just went out there and collected the really obvious artifacts, the projectile points, the pestles and things of that nature, we really wouldn't have a lot of information about what people were doing in the past. So it's really important for people, to work over time to gain the experience to understand what should be there, what you should be looking for, and the proper ways to collect and record that data, because otherwise you're really just, picking out the pretty things and you're just ending up with stuff and not really learning much about the past. And I think that that's sort of part of the cautionary tale here, where sometimes maybe a little bit of knowledge and experience can be a dangerous thing, because it might give someone a false confidence to go out and do this without really understanding all of the things that go on behind the scenes in terms of planning, analysis, interpretation, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out there too, we certainly don't have the time that I would love to have to go into these cultural features we found buried deep in this excavation, starting at about 160 centimeters. But, having the experience and the time helps to identify these stains in the ground, and the stains that we encountered they're old, they're incredibly washed out, they're ephemeral, they're not deep dark stains, they're like shadows, and sometimes you think you're kind of crazy. But as someone who was able to have experience at the Brian D. Jones site a few years ago, I know Sarah, Dave, and Scott, you guys were out there with us. Having that experience made it so that when we did find those features, we were able to pause and say, okay, I think we have something here. Let's reassess and tackle it correctly and carefully. So even though we don't have the time to go into those, that was really crucial with what we have here. And also I'm trying to build upon, obviously finding this site was not the best way to find an archaeological site, but the amount of volunteers that we had that were young undergrads, particularly from Southern Connecticut State and the University of Connecticut and Eastern, who dedicated time to helping us in the field and watching the artifacts and learning about them. That's all steps towards making sure that we are increasing education and of course, moving forward with community outreach as well to educate about these sites is always a great way to help kind of mitigate, not just physically, but as a broader scope, mitigate the impacts of damage to sites such as these.
Yeah, and I think, another important thing to mention in terms of this site is that this site was on town land. It was not threatened. It was safe where it was until it was disturbed. And that's one of the reasons why, we're trying to learn about this, mitigate the damage that was done to it, but we're not going out there planning to do extensive excavations to learn as much as possible about this site, right? Because it will continue to be in a protected area afterwards. So we're trying to balance the needs of preserving the site through the information that we now have to collect with preserving remnants of it, or the bulk of it actually there in the landform for the future. And I think that is something, we also reached out to the 2 federally recognized tribes in Connecticut when this happened, and shared our plan with them as well. And they also expressed a desire that not to disturb the site more than is necessary in this mitigation activity.
And I think it's important. We've talked about the information potential because of the artifacts and the stratigraphy, and we've touched a little bit on the features, but just to give a little bit of context to listeners, some of you might know this. Prior to the discovery of the Brian Jones site, I would say that in all of New England, I haven't done an exhaustive search, but I have done somewhat of a search. There might have been as many as 30 to 40 cultural features that had ever been found at Paleo-Indian sites. And I'm being very generous with that estimate. It's probably less, probably closer to 20 to 25. At the Brian Jones site, there were 27 that were found. making it by far the most cultural features that had ever been found at a Paleo-Indian site. At this site, we have excavated a very small number of excavation units. At Brian Jones, there were 206 excavation units, 1 by 1 meters. Here, there have been 5.5 to 6 or 7 meters, sorry. And there are 5 cultural features, but 4 of those are Pleistocene or early Holocene, suggesting that there are numerous cultural features preserved at the site as well. And the information potential from those far exceeds what you can learn from debitage. You can learn a lot from debitage and artifact distributions, but you can learn much more from cultural features. And that's one of the things that makes not only the site so important, but the preservation mechanisms we talked about at the beginning, right? Because understanding those preservation mechanisms helps us figure out not only why it was preserved here, but why these types of sites might be preserved other places too.
Yeah, and I've been saying it for a long time, but I think that, after the Templeton site and the Jones site, and now with this site all together, you're looking at, within close proximity to each other, 3 deeply buried stratified sites with paleo occupation. And I don't know of any place in the United States that I'm aware of that has that nice layered, separated paleo sites in close proximity. And I think that what I'm hoping comes out of this is researchers in other parts of the country, and certainly in the Northeast, can find these types of sites based on what we've learned about how they're created and where we should look for them along these tributaries and along these river areas where we have this sediment depositing with low velocity flood events.
Yeah. And it's really, there's a combination of factors that create the conditions necessary for this. So at the Farmington River, there is what's called a nick point farther north. There's the Talcott notch where the Farmington River flows through that seems to be controlling the river mechanism, so keeping it sort of stable. But there's also a stream that floods, that feeds into the Farmington River, that probably acted like a shield during big flood events. So there's a lot of water coming out of that stream, and that's sort of pushing the velocity of the Farmington River away from the riverbank that preserves the site. The same thing happens at the Templeton site. There's a stream that does the exact same thing. The same thing happens at the Shawnee-Minisink site, a site in Pennsylvania that has deeply buried Pleistocene deposits. And the same thing happens at a site in Maine that has deeply buried early archaic deposits too. There's a similar mechanism at play at the sand along the Blackstone River that Alan Levely has excavated as well. And so but that's it for New England and the Northeast, those 5 sites. But those are 4 different rivers. 5 different rivers. And those rivers probably aren't very different from all the other rivers either, right? Probably there are deeply buried Pleistocene and Holocene sites waiting to be discovered along other rivers if you look for those different types of preservation mechanisms and fluvial geomorphological mechanisms that are allowing sediment to be built over time and not washed away.
So, I think our plan is to go back out there again in a couple of weeks and to pick up where we left off last fall. We're going to go back out and start to mitigate another one of the excavation areas. We're going to be working with our volunteers as well as the Yukon Archaeological Field School and continuing to work with the town to keep this going. And I think that, there will be more really interesting information that comes out of this site as we work through those other mitigation areas.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in and say, Sarah and Steph and Dave, you guys were kind of the point people on this and have committed the most time and effort and organizational skills to this. And I don't think we'd be able to get on this show and talk about what we're seeing and kind of share some of this exciting research without all the effort that you guys put in. I mean, the volunteers, we had a good time, and we love coming out and supporting the work you're doing. But without you guys leading the charge, so to speak, this site might still be just a hole in the ground filled with back dirt full of artifacts.
Thanks, Scott. So I think that we're just about out of time, wrapping up. If people want to learn more about the site and kind of follow along with us, we'll probably be posting about it on social media over the summer as the excavations progress. We'll also be posting about our upcoming work at the Hollister site, which is going to take place in May. And as always, you can follow the Office of State Archaeology at osa.uconn.edu and our Facebook and Instagram pages. Share where people can get in touch.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, you can get in touch with me at dleslie@terrasearchgeo.com or by going to our website for our other company, Heritage Consultants. Just Google that and you'll find us.
Oh, and you can find me at the University of Connecticut Department of Anthropology page. My email is stephanie.scialo@uconn.edu.
Also, we're on Facebook and on the web. You guys know where we are.